Take us on the journey. Your family was originally from Antwerp?
Originally from Antwerp, and my father, Abraham, and my mother, Augusta, had been married for about 10 years or so before the war broke out. And when things started getting bad in 1940, my father took me and my brothers, my brothers were not in school, I was in school, took us all out into a small village on the North Sea side. The idea being that if the Germans did start a war, the Belgian army would hold them off as they did in World War I, and we'd be nice and safe and sound there. So he rented a villa and bought sacks of potatoes and whatever else he could keep and stocked us up, and that lasted for a couple of days. But anyway, on May 10th, which was the day that the Germans invaded Belgium and Holland, that weekend, my father had stayed behind in Antwerp to run the business, and my mother stayed with us, the kids, and we also had a governess. And that weekend, my mother decided that she would go to Antwerp and spend a weekend with my father, and we would be left in Antwerp, in La Panne, which was a small village, under her care, and they would be back on Sunday afternoon or Monday. Well, that night, the night between May 9th and 10th, or 10th or 11th, I don't remember exactly, but one of those, I remember as a kid hearing all kinds of terrible noises, sirens and explosions, and I remember our governess came down to calm us kids down, and I said, "What's going on? Qu'est-ce qui se passe? What's going on?" And she said, "Oh, there's a storm at sea, and the ships are signaling to each other if they need help or something." Well, like a good kid, I believed her. And then the next morning, everybody looked terrible. People were scared, they were crying. I was befuddled, I guess. I was very scared. And finally, my parents came in the late afternoon looking horrible. They had to take a train. We didn't own an automobile. They took a train from Antwerp, and somehow they got to La Panne, and both parents looked like hell. I'd never seen my parents look like that. It was a very scary time. And then we stayed a couple days, and it became very clear that the Germans were not going to be held back by the Belgian army or anyone else for that matter. And we took a train, and we went south to, I believe it was to Lyon in France. And this was a terrible trip to take. The train was full of refugees and soldiers, and the train stopped here and there and everywhere. It seemed like we would never get to our destination. And one little episode that happened during that trip, which I still remember, was we were in a compartment, and we were seated like we are now, except there were 3 people on both sides. And my 2 brothers and I, we were kids. We were running around, and we kept knocking against one gentleman sitting there. My parents said, "Leave the man alone, he's got a wooden leg," or something like that. And we're kids, what do? You play around. Then at one point they stopped the train, and a whole bunch of soldiers came on board, and they took this man and they took him away. It turned out he was a German spy, and we heard shots, and I believe he was shot on the spot there, which is the way spies are treated during war. I guess you shoot them on sight. And that was my beginning to understand this was not a game. And we had very little food, and then at one point we stopped, and we were stopped by French soldiers. We'd crossed the border, and one of the soldiers took pity on some of us and gave us some of their rations. The train went on to Lyon. Now, I found out later that my family had made plans in Belgium before the war started that we would all meet at a certain place in France and then proceed from there. The other branches of the family, my mother's sisters, all had families. My father's family was not in Belgium. His parents were in Lithuania, where they were eventually murdered by the Germans. And he had a brother in New York, and 2 brothers in New York. And so we were okay. We had my mother's family to go with, and there were two families, so including us, would be three families, and they had cars, so we got three families in two cars, and proceeded to drive south, all the way to Marseille, usually a day or maybe sometimes a half a day or maybe 2 days ahead of the Germans. We stayed in certain places for a while, hoping that the French and the Belgians together would hold off the Germans, and it was not to happen, as you know. And I remember I'd never been to the execution of a king, but I've seen one during the war. Very beginning, Life magazine published their weekly, I don't know if you can call it a magazine, you don't read it, you look at it, a picture of King Leopold, King of the Belgians, on the front page, and we hung it up in the place we were living. And then when Leopold surrendered, my family got kind of angry at him, you might say. They ripped his picture off the wall. Now, I can understand it as a grown-up, but as a kid, this to me was the royal family. I mean, you don't do that. But I was told he was not a good king. The king before was a better king and so forth. But to this day, I remember this as the only time I've ever seen the dethronement of a king was through an artifact, actually. But there it was. Anyway, we went through, then we had another interesting little episode in southern France. I forget exactly where. My two brothers got very ill. They were running high temperatures, they had a rash, and everybody was concerned, so we tried to find a physician. And we get to this small town, and it turns out that there is a physician in this town. He also happens to be the mayor of the town. So they go up to the mayoral, whatever it is, the casa, and he asks, what did we want? And we explained that he said, well, as a mayor of the city, I cannot see you because you're Belgians and you capitulated to the filthy Germans. But as a physician, after 5 o'clock, I will come and see your children. And that's another one of those stories where it shows you that there is humanity still in many people, maybe most. So we got through the German measles, which is of all the diseases to get, we had to have the German measles, which added a touch of irony to it. And eventually we arrived in Marseille, which was then part of, France had capitulated, and it was divided into two parts, one of which was supposedly relatively free, the other one of which was under German occupation. The reality was there was a German occupation throughout France, and Maréchal Pétain, who had been a hero in World War I, turned out to be a rabid anti-Semite and a fascist to boot, and not a very nice person, became the ruler of, I forget what title he had, of France. And I went to school there for, 2 or 3 months, maybe 4, and ran into some interesting little tidbits there. Americans wouldn't understand this, but I'll tell it anyway, or try to explain it. In Belgium and in Switzerland, we speak a slightly different French. So the word for 70 in France is 70, which is 60 plus 10. In Switzerland and in Belgium, it's 70, which is 7 tens. And the same thing is with the number 80. In Switzerland and in Belgium, it's 80, which is 4 times 20. In France, it's, I'm sorry, I've got it mixed up, forgive me, it's the word 90. In France, it's 90, 4 20s and 10. In Switzerland and in Belgium, it's 90, 9 tens. And I went to school, and we had to get up and do sums on the blackboard and explain what we got. And I was laughed at because, tu ne parles pas français. You're not speaking French. The right word is 70. And I said, no, it's 70. I was going to stand up for my rights as a kid, and it just didn't get me very far. Did not win friends or influence people for that matter, but there it was a little bit. It was tough till finally we were able to obtain the proper documents to come to the States, because we had, my father's brother had a business, and he was willing to sponsor us and so forth if we could get the proper documentation. So in order to get from Marseille to Lisbon in Portugal, where the ship was sailing to New York, we had to cross Spain. Well, General Franco, for reasons known only to himself, would not allow any male between the ages of 18 and 45 or something like that across Spain, because he said they would join the English at Gibraltar. If you knew my father, may he rest in peace, is the least likely man to join the army. Anyway, my mother took my two brothers and I through a 4-day trip by train through Spain. It was quite a hectic experience. Spain was just recovering from the Civil War, and there were a lot of ruins and hunger and so forth. I'll never forget, as we went, the border crossing between France and Spain was a little town called Port-Bou, which literally translated as port of mud, which of course, as an 8-year-old, I thought this was the funniest thing I've ever heard. And we go into this room, and we're going to be examined by a customs official. And I'm looking around, and there's a picture on the wall of Francisco Franco. So I look at my mother and I said, "C'est lui le roi des Espagnols? Is that the king of Spain?" Well, the lady behind the desk, who was the customs officer, understood French. And she said to my mother, I forget what language it is, "Explain to your children we do not have kings in Spain anymore. This is our leader, General Francisco Franco." My mother was sure we would be taken out and shot for that, but we got through that one with me and my big mouth. And we finally wound up in Portugal, in Lisbon. And my father had business connections there from before the war. We managed to get a place in a pension, which is basically a boarding house in Portugal, and waiting for my father to book passage from Marseille to, I think it would be to Orient or Casablanca, one of the cities in North Africa, and then take a boat to Portugal. We'd all join up and take the boat to the States. When my father got to Africa, and I don't remember, I think it might have been Casablanca. It rings a bell, but whichever, it was a large town. He went to the Portuguese consul and said, "Here are my papers. I would like your permission to take the boat to Lisbon." And he said, "Well, come back next week, come back next week." And one excuse after another. Finally, the consul took my father aside and said, "Look, I'm not going to lie to you anymore. There is no boat. The only way I can get you out of here is by plane. And for me to give you permission to take a plane," remember this was 1941, or no, it was 40, so flying on an airplane was a big deal in those days. He said, "But if you told me that you said you had 3 children and your wife in Lisbon, if one of your children became very sick, I would be forced to give you a pass." So my father writes to my mother and says, "Please send me a telegram saying children very sick, please come." My mother, God bless her, very superstitious woman, she wouldn't do it, because she was convinced that if she wrote that, it would happen. It took quite a bit of persuasion by mail, which took 4 or 5 days each way. So finally he sent a telegram, "Children very sick, come at once," and the rest was done. But to her dying day, when any one of us kids got sick, my mother would say, "It's because I sent that telegram." So it shows the way some people think, and the effect that it has. So finally we did get a passage on a boat called the SS Simony, which originally was on the run between Havana and Miami. It was not a very big ship or a very sturdy one, and we crossed in February, I guess, of 1941, in the worst mid-Atlantic crossing on record or something. The ship was tossed back and forth like a cork. There were times when the the tail of the boat was out of the water. The propellers were spinning. We were told if they spin too long out of the water, they're going to break off and we're done. As a matter of fact, our people in New York told us that our ship had been reported sunk. But obviously, as you can see, I'm still here. I was sick. My two brothers were sick. My mother was sick. My father took seasickness like a champ. Brought us food to our cabins. I don't think I ate for it took us 5 or 7 days to cross the Atlantic. And I don't remember, except for a half a day when we passed by Bermuda, we were stopped by the British Navy, who insisted on their right to make sure we weren't bringing contraband back and forth or whatever it was. And I remember, at last this isn't moving anymore. Things are well, a few hours later, toot toot, and off we went. And I was sick until we got to New York. And we stayed in New York for 2 months, living with relatives. And
the first one is, as you sailed into New York Harbor,
yes.
What were your feelings then? Do you remember that?
Yes. I was scared to death. Partly because there were some glitches in our papers. I don't know what it was. We had to stay on board ship an extra night after everybody else had gone away. Then we got to Ellis Island, and I did not know English. I didn't know what was happening, what we were going to do. I had no nameable fear. It's just a general very high anxiety, just scared of being scared. And I remember people in Ellis Island were trying to be nice to us, but I didn't understand what they were saying. Though a gesture of offering somebody a piece of candy or something is universally acceptable. But what if you don't know who that person is? And maybe they're trying to kill you. And before we got to the States, I remember in Marseille, when I was saying goodbye to the people I'd gone to school with, some of whom I became friendly with, they warned me about the United States. It was filled with gangsters who shoot people on sight and all kind of Indians, and I didn't see any Indians, and I saw nobody shot on sight, and if I saw gangsters, I didn't recognize them. I was very frightened. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew is I think what I resented most at that time, and still do, there were two things. One was being taken out of school. I loved school. I did well in school. And the other one was, there's a French author, La Comtesse de Ségur, who wrote children's books. And I had a complete set of her books, like 10 or 12 volumes, which we had to leave behind. It's funny what you miss, but as you can see, I still feel that loss. And anyhow, we stayed in New York for, I guess it was 2 months, and finally, we were told we had to leave. Now, in those days, a lot of people said, yeah, we have to leave, so they would make up excuses or something, and many people managed to stay beyond till the war started, at which point America changed its modus operandi. But we took a boat from New York through the Panama Canal, then up again to Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then across the Pacific to Manila. And this was a very interesting trip in its own right. It was a freighter, which took a few passengers, flying under the Norwegian flag. And the captain was something out of Joseph Conrad, looking back at it. Mr. Kurtz was not there, but it was something out of Conrad. And he was warning us that, Norway is technically at war with Japan and we could be sunk. So we went through that with this fear of, what would happen if we got torpedoed and sunk. But anyway, we made it across. As you can see, we're there. And we landed in Manila in, I guess it was April or May. I don't remember exactly. It was about 4 or 5 months before Pearl Harbor, which means Pearl Harbor was in December, so that's 12. So it was somewhere in April or May. And we found an apartment where we stayed, and my father was, at that time, busy managing, among other things, managing my uncle. His brother had a factory which made women's slips and pajamas and stuff like that, unmentionables. And then the war broke out. And war broke out December 8th, our time there, that side of the timeline. And by January 1st, the Japanese had marched into Manila. They did march in. Manila had been declared an open city.
Let me stop you because I'd like to take you back a little bit before that.
Sure.
You talk about the trip itself. At any point did your parents try to portray it to you, because you were obviously a sensitive child? You were young, you didn't understand what was going on. Did they try to portray it to you as we're on this incredible adventure, or was their sense of fear and fear of the unexpected palpable as well?
Mostly the latter. Let me go back to Marseille. There were 3 families of us living there, all related, obviously. And there was, I remember the house, there was a large dining room table where we would eat our meals communally, whatever food we could get. And I remember one day, it was in the afternoon, I think. Some bad news came. I don't know what it was. And my Aunt Rosa, who was my mother's older sister, shrieked out, "Was will sein mit uns?" What will happen to us? And that spread like contagion. And everybody began to cry and weep and gnash their teeth. We didn't know what would happen to us. And I think that's when I began to realize that everybody was scared. And nobody ever explained that I can remember. I can't vouch for what might or might not have happened. I can only tell you what I believe happened. Fear was the utmost emotion. And it was a fear of bad things happen, not fear like, when will it happen? They will happen. They will not going to be pleasant. You're not going to like it. And this went on for years and years, and it's still part of me now.
Given your profession now as a psychologist, when you look back on that, what sort of thing does that do to a kid?
Well, it teaches you basically that you learn certain behaviors and certain ways of looking at the world. And if that becomes part of your personality, it will take some work to change it, and it does. If you live in people who look at the world as being a dangerous place which is going to hurt you, and no matter what you do, you got to watch over your shoulder or throw salt or whatever you do, then you're going to do the same thing, and eventually it becomes part of the way you understand the world to run. And those are very deeply ingrained, and it takes quite a bit of work to get past them, and sometimes they surface up as they just did 70 years later. You talk about them and they come up again because these memories are there. And when they're touched on, where something ignites it, the tears begin to flow and the emotions come up, and for a moment there you sort of relive that moment, and it takes a certain amount of effort to get past it. And for many years, I just denied the whole thing. Didn't tell anybody about this. People I'd met, people I knew at school, whatever. I never talked about it because I wanted to forget it, and I couldn't.
One of the things that we've found with this, and it's very interesting, is that the refugees we talk to can recite dates and can tell you very basic things, but it's almost as if they were closed off, that there's only so far that they can go, and they can recite things, but they don't necessarily are not able to express it in terms of feelings or how this felt or how this smelled or anything like that. Is that a natural reaction, do you think? Well,
obviously these people give you natural reactions. They're natural people. They're not extraterrestrials. However, it's a good way if you're going to talk about or bring up something that has a highly charged emotional context, and it brings back pain, one way of stopping that is to become very, very literal. Yes, the room was there, it was green, it had a blue carpet, and there were pictures on the wall. And the first picture was of such and such, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's one way of staying away from the affect of the emotional part of it. I did that for a while. I don't anymore because it doesn't matter. It's still there. You can't escape it. It's there. There is not a day that passes that somehow or other I get a fleeting, sometimes more than a fleeting, but usually a fleeting, something that will remind me of something during these years. And just about all of it is painful.
Corollary to that is that the Frieda brothers, who set most of this in motion, and actually I think your family was able to get over there because of joint resolution committee and the criteria that they had set for emigration to the Philippines. The Frieda brothers themselves did not really seem to talk about this much afterwards either. It was a part of their life, and then they moved on to other things when they came to the U.S. Do you have any sort of idea why that might be? Why they wouldn't have shared that? Because now, and it's very hard for somebody from my generation, where everything is shared with everybody, to understand how they may not talk about that at all.
Well, I think you put your finger on part of it. Their generation is not yours. In those days, in that generation, and I'm more a part of that than I am of the younger generation, you did not express your emotions. You just didn't do it. You kept things to yourself. You talked about things that were on the table, you talked about the pictures on the wall, but you did not talk in any kind of depth about how you were feeling. And I remember being told, no, don't cry. Don't cry. It hurts. But that was a way of looking at the world. That your emotions are private, they're yours, and you don't share them, except maybe with a few very intimate people. Today, fortunately, I think, we are more open to that. We are more willing to listen, and we're more willing to be empathetic to these things. But there was a time when we didn't care. Your experiences were your experiences. Like, get along, move on, get back on the horse, and go round up the cattle, or whatever it is you were doing. And I suspect the Frieda brothers, this was part of their life. This was the way things were, and you just go on.
Given a world where danger lurked around every corner and a spy could be sitting across from you in a train, was it also self-preservation?
Probably. Don't say anything because somebody might misinterpret it, and they might be a spy.
Getting back to your story, do you remember sailing into Manila Harbor?
Yes, I do.
Could you describe that in painstaking detail?
Well, it was a beautiful day, I remember that. Almost every day is beautiful in the tropics, except when it's the rainy season, when it's wet. It was very hot, as it usually is. And we were on the deck of the ship watching us come in, and I could see the city, and I was a little bit surprised because I was 9 years old. I thought Manila was going to be a city where people lived in tents. I expected to see row after row of white pup tents, and we would be living in one of these tents. I was not aware, and I was a fairly well-read kid. I was a stamp collector. I had read about every country I had stamps from, and so forth. It just amazing. This is a real city. I mean, there are real houses, and there are cars and street cars, and a lot of horses and things like that going around. And I remember pulling in and thinking, okay, this is going to be something new, and my aunt and uncle were there to greet us. And the rest of it was sort of like a flurry of going from here to there, till we finally found a place to live. And I went to school for a while and so forth. And the other thing that I remember is suddenly, it seems to me, I'm sure it didn't happen quite this way, but the way I remember it, I suddenly found myself speaking English fluently. I was able to understand most of what was going on. which is one of the reasons my parents slipped into Yiddish whenever they didn't want me to understand. Of course, I learned Yiddish by listening to them, so that was the end of that one. But anyway, I remember being afraid. I remember partly because I soiled my pants. I was scared. Kids do that. Adults do that. And I don't think I was quite that. I was more afraid that I wouldn't fit in or it wouldn't work. And when are we going back to Belgium? When is this stupid war going to be over? I want to go back to my school, go back to my books and the house we lived in, which I loved. And life would be the way it was. The way it was. It was not to be. Oh, the other thing I remember, I don't know how many passenger ships still travel. When the ship landed, there was a band on land, a Filipino band, and they were playing songs which I'd never heard before, but with a very catchy rhythm. And I thought, hey, that's nice. That's what they do here, play music. But I didn't know other specific remembrances.
Do you remember whether the Frieders or members of the committee were there to greet you?
That I don't remember. I mean, they may very well have been, but I don't know. I was a kid, and whenever things of importance were going to be discussed or happen, kids were sent out for fear we might be spies, I guess. I would have made a good spy, except I wouldn't know who to report to.
So you settled in, but it was never presented to you that this was the final place. This was just another stop on the road.
Oh, exactly. We were going to be in the Philippines for 6 months to a year until the magic word, the quota number, came up. The quota number is a number made up by the State Department. How many people of every national group can come into the country at a given year? And it's X number, and when your number came up, you could come, and until that came up, you could die. They didn't care. And then we would stay in the Philippines for 6 months or a year, and then come back to the States and stay there and wait out the war. Well, the Japanese had other thoughts. So on December 8th, in our calendar there, the war broke out, and the rest is history. We came under Japanese occupation. And even then, even under Japanese occupation, a rumor had started, which probably had some truth in it, because part of it did come true, that we're going to evacuate the non-combatants from European countries out of the Philippines to South Africa on a Swedish ship called the Gripsholm. And we were going to be packed and waiting for the Gripsholm, and we would be taken out of there. I don't know whether the ship ever came. I didn't know anybody who left, but there was this dream talking about when the Gripsholm comes, we can leave. So there was, for a long time, there was this thought that we were not going to be here forever. We'd be taken out. And we were eventually taken out, but not by the Swedes, but by the Americans.
Going back pre-war, do me a favor, describe the sights, the smells, the way Manila was to a 10-year-old boy at that point?
Yeah, I was about 10. No, 10, almost 10. I was 10 in November of 1941, or 42, 49, whatever. Anyway, I'm not good at numbers. I freak out. Damn near didn't get my degree for that. But first thing I remember is the lushness. Manila is this city at the bottom of like a U-shaped bay, Manila Bay, and the bay, and at the end of the bay, the two arms, one was called Bataan, and I forget what the other one was called, and there was an island there called Corregidor, which was like the cork in the bottle. And people, and on the Manila side, there was a beautiful drive called Dewey Boulevard. And on the shore side, there were the magnificent hotels where the wealthy, like the MacArthurs and the Eisenhowers and people like that, would live. fancy. Manila Hotel was the big one. Very beautiful plantings. But anybody could walk on Dewey Boulevard. There'd be little people with pedicabs selling ice cream and things like that, and you watch the sunset. And if you've never seen a sunset in the tropics, you've never seen a sunset. It's absolutely incredible. To this day, I can remember the beauty of the colors, and it was cool. The day was hot, but in the evening it got cool. When I say cool, I mean maybe 82 or something like that, but cool, and a breeze, a sea breeze, so it wasn't quite so moist. And I remember seeing people of different, totally different ethnic backgrounds, Filipinos, Chinese, people like that, and all of them speaking another language, not English. What else?
Was it the Pearl of the Orient at that point?
Was what?
Was it really the Pearl of the Orient?
It was a beautiful city. We had seen parts of it. There were two cities, really. There were three. There was Intramuros, which means between the walls or in the walls, the old Spanish city going back to the 17th century, if not earlier, which was picturesque, and it was big walls with sentry posts and things like that. Very, very historical, so to speak. Then there was a newer city, which was like almost any city you'd go to. Then there was another city which was just being built called New Manila, which later became Quezon City, which was the more modern part on the other side. Manila sort of bisected by a river, the Pasig River. And on the other side of the river, they were building a new city, which was going to be ultra-modern. But what they had, the civic buildings, all were very attractive-looking buildings. The post office looked like, all post office should have looked like the Pantheon, but nobody spoke Greek there. Anyway, I'm sure there were people. As a matter of fact, I had a friend who was Greek, whose family was Greek. But anyway, the other thing I remember, there was all kinds of strange food, particularly fruits, some of which were very good. You said smells. Papaya. Papaya has a very peculiar odor. And it took me a long time to get past that odor to taste the fruit. And once you taste it, it's very good. But the smell of papaya is indescribably bad to stay in good taste. But anyway, all kinds of fruits. Many were very good. And the other thing was there was a Jewish community. And one of the first things my father did was go meet the movers and shakers. And here we go again. We joined the only synagogue, Temple Emil, and I went to Sunday school there. Now here again we ran into a language problem. My father was an ardent Zionist, and in Belgium, I went to a school called Takamoni, which was like what you would call a day school here in the States, where in the morning we did everything in Hebrew, and in the afternoon we'd do it in French. So I became bilingual by the time I was 8. I could fluently speak, read, and write Hebrew and French, as fluently as an 8-year-old could do it. I was not writing poetry, but I could get by very well. And the school was a Zionist backed, and so they used a Sephardic pronunciation for Hebrew, which basically means certain letters are sounded differently than in the Ashkenazi, which is the German pronunciation. And the school was run 99.99% by Germans, and they all laughed when I would pronounce words slightly differently. But I had the last laugh because I knew how to read and write script. Hebrew script is different than the printed language, as it is in many languages. They had never learned this. So that's my only claim to a positive difference. But we went, and I remember going to services even throughout the war. I used to try to get there on Friday nights even. My parents didn't go, and I did. I felt something good was there for me. And I became very friendly with a number of people there, and one of the people who wrote the book, Escape to Manila, Frank Ephraim, he and I became very close friends. He would visit our apartment, we would visit him, I would visit him. We would go and we would do things which kids today wouldn't dare do. It's much too dangerous. We would go into Manila, just the two of us, we'd walk into town, and nobody seemed to believe anything terrible would happen to us. And nothing terrible did. We had our own little adventures. We looked at things, poked around, do the kind of things curious 10-year-old boys do, some 10-year-old boys. And there was a place, and the synagogue was really the major social part for us, because even during the war there were weddings and bar mitzvahs and things like that happening there under the watchful eye of the Japanese. But it was there.
Pre-war, it sounds like Manila was almost an idyllic place.
Except for the weather, the temperature was. My mother would curse at it every day. This is absolutely horrible. And today we laugh. Oh, you just turn on the air conditioner. Pray tell, sir, what is an air conditioner? Oh, those things you have in hotels and in fancy restaurants. People didn't have them in their home. Maybe some people did, but we never did. And of course, at night you would sleep under a mosquito net because, God forbid, you should get bitten by the tsetse fly or some other insect that carried diseases. And if you've ever slept under a mosquito net, it's a very uncomfortable experience. It's hot enough. You don't need this thing hanging over your head. And we also had, the other thing was, which I noticed very quickly, I couldn't say much or do much about it. I detected and did not like, and still don't like, and never will like, the feelings of superiority that white people had over others. First, against the Filipinos, they were not considered intelligent. They were all thieves. They were hired as servants for as little as you could get for them, and you had to watch everything they did because they, et cetera, et cetera. It's, I guess my strong left-wing libertarian kind of ideas go back to that time. But even worse than that, or as bad as that, was the German Jews made fun of us who were not German Jews. They were more German than Jewish in many ways. They kept on speaking German together, which I did not understand. I could not understand how they could do this. I mean, they'd been kicked out of there by this horrible man, and they continued being German, and they wanted to go back to Germany. I never fathomed that.
You were only there for a few months before the war broke out,
right.
Before the bombing. Describe the bombing, the first day.
Actually, most of the bombing that we heard was from a distance, because very soon after the declaration of war, MacArthur made Manila an open city, which meant there would be no fighting. The Japanese wanted to march in, they could. We would not fight. So we did not see, there was no fighting to speak of. In 1941, they just came in and took it, and that was the end of that.
Was there a sense of despair that the Americans had just abandoned the city?
Yes, there was some of that, but there was also the feeling it wouldn't last long. They would get tired. The Japanese would get tired of it, or they would lose the war very quickly anyway. Or the big rumor was the mile-long convoy that had set sail from San Francisco. It was a mile long of ships which were going to bring troops and tanks and guns and God knows what and rescue us all. Well, it was a nice fancy, but there was no mile-long convoy, and there was no being saved. One of the first things the Japanese did was they issued currency, and the trick was not to accept it, but if you didn't accept it and you were turned over to the Japanese authorities, you would regret not having accepted it. So my father would send me out to try and barter for fruits and things like that from local people until things got stabilized, but never to take it when we got change, to always ask for silver, which was American Filipino currency. That didn't last very long. Very soon, the Japanese printing presses were. Towards the end of the war, you could be a millionaire and not be able to buy a cup of coffee. The paper was the money wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on.
It sounds like Manila at that point, to go back to it, was a little bit like Casablanca. It was open. There were people bartering. There were people waiting to get out. It was hot. It almost seems like it was a scene from Casablanca.
In some ways, yes, I just saw Casablanca a few weeks ago. It happens to be one of my favorite American movies. Every time I see it, I see something new and different in it. There were all the Americans and the British and the Dutch who had declared war on Japan were interned in a concentration camp in Santo Tomas, which there was no equivalent in Casablanca that I know of. And other than that, yeah, there were a lot of similarities. The weather was horrible. It was very hot. There were Japanese troops everywhere. And I mean everywhere. They would, wherever they wanted to be, they would dig. One of the things they did was they would dig latrines for the use of their soldiers, almost anywhere. And they'd put a very flimsy barrier around it, but you can't escape the smell. An open pit latrine is an open pit latrine. I don't care how you do it. And the Japanese, of course, helped themselves to whatever they liked. And what the Japanese soldiers really liked, were watches. And they would either buy or steal or whatever. And you'd see them walking around with 4 or 5 wristwatches on one arm and 3 or 4 on the other arm. What the fascination for watches was, I never found out, but this is what they liked, watches.
Go back to the Casablanca analogy a little bit, too. It was hot, it was oppressive, people interned at Santo Tomas, but how else was it that way? Was there a sense of desperation? Was there a sense that this is a way station towards my final destination?
Well, I can't speak for anybody other than ourselves. We had a feeling that eventually the Japanese would lose the war and we'd get back to the States and start life all over again, either in the States or go back to Belgium. And most people felt they wanted to go back. Most of the European population wanted to go back to wherever they had come from. All my little friends that I had, most of them were, not most, all of them practically were originally from Germany, and they talked fondly of going back to Frankfurt or Berlin or whatever major metropolis they lived in and how much nicer things were there. Well, it wasn't.
And you yourself, were you bar mitzvahed at Temple Inn?
No. I was fortunate that we came back to this country in 1945, right after the war, and in January of 46, I was bar mitzvahed in New York City, which is a long time ago.
The temple itself continued even under Japanese
Yes, it did. And can I tell you another story?
Please.
The most sacred days in the Jewish calendar are Rosh Hashanah, which is the beginning of the year, and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Well, during Rosh Hashanah services, the temple was filled. It got very hot. We didn't have air conditioning in the temple either, only in hotels. And the rabbi and the cantor, both of which had been of German extraction, had the vestments and the hats, and it was really a magnificent spectacle. Everybody was facing the ark, as is the custom, when suddenly we heard a noise on the back, and nobody wanted to turn around, but the cantor was facing the audience, and his voice began to quaver, and he began to cry. Like I am now. And what had happened was the Japanese had taken the Jewish members, the Jewish prisoners at Santo Tomas camp who wanted to go. They had taken them to the services under strict guard. They were not allowed to talk to anyone, and no one was allowed to talk to them. But a couple hundred of them, I think, I can't tell you how many, I honestly do not remember, but a significant number were brought in for the services. And as soon as it was over, they were hurried back on the bus and taken back. This happened once or twice, and that was it. And again, move forward 70 years. somebody. There were some bodies in the Japanese ruling had the heart. And despite the fairly cruel way in which the civilians were treated, nevertheless, they understood the need for the religious expression and allowed this to happen. And every once in a while after that, there would be a Japanese man in civvies who was, you couldn't tell he wasn't a regular congregant. He looked just like the rest of us, sure. They were following people who they thought might be spies, but they were very respectful. I had not seen one. I have not seen that. Doesn't mean there weren't any, but I have not seen any anti-Semitic behavior by the Japanese. I saw a lot from the Filipinos because, after all, I had killed Christ, who I didn't even know who he was. Nevertheless, that I had killed him, and many a beating that I suffered for something I not only didn't do, but didn't even know what it was. So in that sense, I don't hold that animosity against the Germans. They were not, the Japanese were not anti-Semitic, as far as I could tell. Now, others will tell you other stories, perhaps. This is what I saw.
The thinking was that most of the Jewish residents were of Germanic background.
Yes.
So that they were allies, so they were thought of as German, not necessarily Jewish.
That's part of it. But the Germans didn't think of them as being Germans. But what happened, at the end of the war, the Japanese fought for Manila block by block. And I am told that this is a true story. I've not seen it documented, but I've been told that the Germans had taken refuge in the German embassy with a huge swastika flag hanging and so forth. And at one point, things got so hot that they apparently had to move across the street. And in this process, a Japanese turned his machine gun and mowed them all down. And none of us felt any regret. Then there's also this story. You want another story?
Is this the story about your brother with the scooter?
Yes.
Yes, please tell that story.
We lived, this was, I guess, a year and a half or so into the occupation. We lived on a street called M.H. del Pilar, named after a Filipino, a hero of resistance against the Spaniards. We lived in an apartment, and my two brothers and I, we played like kids. We knew other kids and so forth. And we'd become fairly friendly. The two apartment houses down was taken over by the Japanese as a garrison. And the Japanese, at least in the beginning, loved children. They just loved us. They would buy us ice cream. They would talk. We exchanged smiles and things like that. It was scared the crap out of my parents, but we had very good relationships with most of the Japanese, the officers as well as the enlisted men. Well, my brother had a scooter. And I say a scooter. This was two pieces of wood joined together with L-shaped brackets and roller skates underneath. Very noisy. And he would like to go up and down the street. There wasn't any traffic. But further down the street where we were some Nazis. They were not just Germans, they were Nazis. Every day they would fly this swastika flag. And one day, in late afternoon, early afternoon, I guess, it was very hot. My brother comes back crying. What happened? He said, they took my skateboard away. Who? The Germans took it away from me. And at that point, a corporal, I guess, he was a corporal in the Japanese army, Corporal Muna, tried to find out, he spoke a little English, and I think somebody else spoke a little French, figured out why they want to know why was my brother, at that point he was about 5 or 6. Why was he crying his heart out? What happened? And we explained it to them. So he goes into the billet, comes back with 4 or 5 soldiers with guns and bayonets. They march up to the German's house, knock on the door, wake the poor guy up. Poor guy, wake the son of a bitch up. I'm sorry, erase that. Said, give the kid back his scooter. Of course, they weren't going to argue with guys with bayonets. So Eric, my brother, took it, and he was carrying it. And they said, no, no, no. You were running back and forth in front of their house. He didn't want to do it. They insisted. They were going to give him what for, and they did. And ever since that time, we think that this was our first blow against the Nazis.
The scooter blow.
The scooter blow.
It all starts with a little spark, I guess.
That's all it takes.
I would assume that you also saw a lot of atrocities.
Yes, I did. One day there was a huge ruckus in the street, and went out to see what was going on. And as I said before, there was Japanese had taken over the apartment complex next to ours. They had apparently caught somebody, a Filipino, stealing. They tied him to a telephone pole and proceeded to systematically beat him to death with people watching. That was my first and most vivid vision of the cruelty that man can hold against another man, person against a person, to be politically correct. But they beat this guy for hour after hour after hour. And eventually he died. That was the closest to actual venom, actual lack of any kind of compassion for a fellow human being, no matter what he had done. The other thing that I see were mostly long-distance explosions going off and smelling death and seeing it and so forth. But you asked about horrible things. This was the worst single event.
And these were the same soldiers, the same group that would eventually recover your brother's scooter.
Yes. People are strange, aren't they?
You tell me.
No. They had a code, and you mentioned this when we were talking before with the bridge on the River Kwai. The Japanese had a code called the Bushido. This was a way you behaved. If you didn't behave this way, you were less than human, and we could do anything we wanted to you because you didn't matter. But this is not very different from the Germans, who said if you were an Aryan, you didn't matter. If you were Polish or Yugoslavian or Belgian or whatever, or Jewish, you weren't really people. But if you believed in the code, you had to act a certain way in certain conditions which were clearly circumscribed, and one of them was that you're nice to children. That was just part of it. And so you could be nice to kids, and well, did you see The Boy in the Striped Pajamas? Did you ever see that movie?
Yeah.
See it. It would take too long to explain the whole, but even the Germans showed here and there some now you can believe anything you want. I like to believe that we are all endowed with some spark of humanity, and society and other things put a damper on it. And sometimes something comes and sort of opens up that, or blows that into a full-fledged flame. It might just be seeing a kid crying. How can you resist a child crying? Well, some people can. Parents, they're called. But
I mean, I was going to say this in the end, but again, especially given what your life's work is and what you have seen, have you drawn any sort of conclusions about the nature of man, the nature of humans, or what is it that you can kind of enlighten other people about? You have a very unique perspective. You have the professional perspective, but you also have the personal history too, the personal experiences.
Well, what I try and imbue, remember, most of my patients are people who have been injured at work, who are on workers' compensation. They are treated very badly by the system. I need to work with these people, among other things, to prevent the poison from spreading, not to take it personally, that each person as an individual has feelings, beliefs, and acts on them depending on how the situation is. There's a famous sort of joke about Skinner, the first behaviorist, supposedly. Apparently, as a takeoff on Skinner, they said, the Skinner law of human behavior is humans behave as they damn well please. No, under perfectly controlled conditions, humans will behave as they damn well please. So, I like to believe, and I tell people, you try and find somewhere, without being Pollyannish about it, that everybody has some trait of humanity, or most people seem to have some trait of humanity, and for some reason it's shut off. And part of my job as a therapist is to help bring that flame up, and your job to my patient is to learn to accept this, and that it's not personal. That when the insurance company won't let you have a certain operation, it's not personal. It's the greed of the insurance. Greed is a universal human trait. Everybody's greedy. Maybe not everybody, but corporations all are. Money is accrued by being greedy. And insurance companies earn money by collecting premiums and not paying claims, the way the money stays in one place. And I think because of what we are, any given person can do some pretty terrible things. Some of the work that was done about 30 years ago with who was the psychologist? He made people had the opportunity to raise electric currents. I forget who it was that did it. My names, don't always remember. People will do things which you would not, if you ask them, would you do it? Oh, no, not me, I wouldn't do it. But you put them in a certain condition, they will. And there are very few people who can resist those conditions. We call them heroes. And I think that's part of what heroism is to stand up for what you believe to be right, despite everything around you that says, no, you shouldn't, you don't need to do this. But most people make compromises with the devil. And that's how they survive.
In your situation, with what you went through, who acted heroically?
I think a lot of people did. To me, being a hero is not doing something of supernatural event, like making the cat fly or something like that. Heroism is to be able to stand up for what you believe, no matter what, and do your best you can to make that. I think my parents were heroes. I think most of the prisoners, Dutch, American, English, and so forth, were heroes to put up with Santa Tomas for all of those years. They're in terrible conditions. I think some of the Japanese were heroes who would befriend us and help us on occasion. They were heroes. Anybody who stood up against the oppressiveness, I think, are heroes. I cannot say that so-and-so was a hero, because then it says others were not. Now, there are some people, historically, I didn't know them, like the Japanese consul in Lithuania who stamped visas till the last days of the war to help Jews get out of Europe. And there were a few other cases. There are people who did heroic tasks, but everybody did heroic tasks. Some are measured or are known because they affect more people. If you stamp 10,000 visas, there are 10,000 people who know you. If you save one kid, the kid knows you, but you're still a hero.
What about people like the Frieders and Quezon and McNutt, who kind of conspired, at least at great political risk and personal risk, maybe not safety, but to set in place the whole mechanism to allow the refugees?
They were obviously people of very strong ethical feeling, and they were going to do what needed to be done despite the pressure of the State Department and other places. And yes, their acts were heroic in that definition of the word. Others might quibble with me on the definition, but yes, they believed something, and they were going to see to it that it happened, and they did their best.
Why is it that there are some people like that who will do that, and then the vast majority of people won't?
I don't know. That is one of the great mysteries. If you read the literature of what happened in Europe, how come there was this priest, this minister who saved the whole village? And when asked, why did you stand up? He says, because it was the right thing to do. There are some people who just believe there is a right thing to do when you do it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be religious or anything other than just, I believe this is the right thing to do and I will not do it any other way. Why some people are like that and some are not, I guess if I had the answer to that, I'd be in Stockholm getting the prize from the King of Swedes, but I don't have the answer.
Going back now to your story, war is over with. You see the Jewish American soldiers come in, and there is this enormous Passover celebration, for which George Lowenstein recites the 4 questions. Describe what that was like to somebody of your age, your religion, the whole thing, the Jeep ride there and everything else.
Well, the word came down that there was going to be a Passover celebration. Now, we had Passover celebrations during the occupation, but they were in the home, and they were, as most Passover celebrations are, and quiet. We had matzah, we made matzah, and so forth. It was ersatz matzah because there was no wheat flour available. I forget what we did, but we did things. We were told that there would be a communal Passover liberation of Manila, because Passover is a holiday of liberation. And we were told we would be picked up by the courtesy American Army. They would bring us to the racetrack, and we would be there, and they would bring us back. At that time, there were still Japanese holdouts in little pockets here and there who would take pot shots at people. And I remember a Jeep came by, and a soldier came out and said, Mr. Lipetz, and my father said, yes, were you and your family, we were going to take you to your services. And we all piled into this Jeep, which I believe had no springs. It felt that way anyway. And the road was badly pockmarked with shell holes and what have you. It took us to this racetrack. The name of which I think it was Luneta, but I'm not sure. It was big. I'd never been to a racetrack. And we were seated in, I guess they're called bleachers or bleacher-type seats. And sure enough, there was a service. There were 2 rabbis and matzah and the 4 questions. And it was a wonderful experience. It brought to mind at that time that we were really free. And to this day, when I attend a Seder, as I try to every year, I'm always reminded of that. We did, in the Haggadah, the order of service is the order of service is that every man should tell the story of the Exodus as if he himself, excuse the political incorrectness, as if he or she had himself, herself, escaped from Egypt. And I've tried to do that. I don't know whether I've succeeded or not, but I try, because I really do feel that particular event was a milestone in my own development as a person, that freedom can be gotten, and we can escape Egypt. We don't have to stay in Egypt. We can get out, and we did. And I wrote you've seen this on the web. There's a story about that. And it'll go to the grave with me, which is the way all stories eventually wind up. But yeah, it was a very, very moving, a very long-lasting, as you can see, effect. Then we rode back in the dark because we were not allowed to, soldiers were not allowed to turn lights on because there were snipers around. So the way the jeeps maneuvered at night during the war, they had a black circle over the headlights with a tiny slit, so there'd be just enough light so you could sort of see where you thought the road might be, or where it should be. So it was an adventure going back. We took some matzah. They gave us some matzah to bring back, and that was a very touching experience.
Do you think it was as touching for the others there as it was for you?
I believe so. Maybe it struck different chords, but it was touching because we saw a lot of people. Remember that as the Japanese were losing the war, they became more and more cruel and more difficult. And the battle for Manila had a lot of Jewish, among others, population thrown out of their homes and being chased and so forth. And the ability to reunite as a community was signaled the end of an era, the beginning of a new era. And I think everybody felt some of that. And plus, I don't remember how much wine went around, but I suspect a few people got a little happier than they had been for a while, although there was no shortage of alcoholic beverages. In the Philippines, they made rum. And there was a lot of rum available. It's horrible stuff, but you used to get, I know my father, I still don't know if it's an excuse or not. Rum was sold in demijohns, which is a large wicker-covered bottle holding, I forget how many liters, but it stands about so high. We always had one at home, and my father would mix it with water. He said, the water is so terrible, we have to put rum in it. Today, I wonder if my father liked the rum a little too much sometimes, but I don't think so. But I never got to really like rum. It's not my drink, but the wine was different. It was sacramental, and I suspect it was Manischewitz or something like that. It was pretty awful stuff, but nevertheless, it was a moment of joy. And 4 years of living in fear, or almost 4 years of fear and so forth, to be able to enjoy it, to laugh, to sing, to greet people you hadn't seen for a while, to find out about some people who hadn't made it. Yeah, that was very, very impressive thing. I suspect anybody else who you interview who was in Manila at that time will tell you similar kinds of stories.
How do you let that go? You get it in tissue. Oh.
What?
The tissue just
Oh, I'm sorry. I could have done that.
How do you let that go?
Why?
Should you let it go?
No.
Why?
I think it was Santillana who wrote, if you do not remember the lessons of history, you will be condemned to relive them over and over. We have to remember. It's because we forget that it happens again. You know, if you ever go to England, if you've been there, there's a town called Coventry outside of London which had a cathedral. And it was, the Germans bombed the crap out of Coventry. They leveled it. And there was a medieval cathedral which was also destroyed. I went to visit it when I was in the United Kingdom. And I am not a Christian, but I believe in religion. And on the altar, there is a cross made out of 2 burned embers from the cathedral, joined together with some wire. And on it says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." That's the part that you have to also remember. That the people who do this to us don't really know what they're doing. But if we forget what could happen, it could happen again. And is happening again as we speak all over the world. There are atrocities in Syria, in Sudan, you name the place. And we have to not accept this as part of humankind. We have to remove this. But we can only remove it, we can only stop accepting it if we believe it did happen and it was terrible.
Is there anything I've left out you think is important for people to know?
I think the most important thing, one of the things that Frank Ephraim, who has passed away, talked about was, what is the lesson to be learned from the Holocaust, from the war? I don't know. I am not a philosopher, but I think the lesson is that we must learn to pay more attention to what we do and the consequences thereof, and realize there are consequences to everything we do. And some of these consequences can be very, very, very bad. And only by remembering that things can be bad can we do our best to keep things as good as we can make them. It's too wordy for an aphorism, but
Too wordy for a T-shirt, but how do you? It sounds stupid and Pollyannish, but how do you make people love each other, or at least coexist?
we don't have to love each other. We have to respect each other. The Indians have a greeting. They hold their hands together and say namaste, which basically means I recognize the God within you. Maybe that's what we should do. Recognize that the other person is a human being just like you are. He or she bleeds when they're cut. It's in The Merchant of Venice. When you cut us, do we not bleed? Shakespeare had that. That is what we have to learn, that we are all, no matter whether we're tall or small, black or red or green or blue or yellow or whatever color we are, our eyes, our skin, we speak differently, it doesn't matter. Underneath, in a very, very shallow layer above, underneath, we're all human beings. Let's recognize that. And I think one of the lessons or people who tried to get this across was, I think, whoever put together what we call the Bible in Western civilization. It tells the story of Adam and Eve. Why did God only create two people? Well, some of the sages have written and said it's to show that we are all of one kind. Some of us weren't created first or last or in the middle or better or worse. We're all the same. And I think that's an important thing to do. We can remember that that guy, or that woman, or that person has feelings like you do, who can cry the way you can, who can laugh the way you can. It'll be a much better world. How do you teach that? By example is what I try and do. I don't always succeed.